All right, get ready, because we're diving into some fascinating stuff today. Neuroscience, spirituality. I mean, can we actually pinpoint spirituality in the brain? Is there like a God spot?
It's a question that, well, it's a question people have been asking forever, haven't they? And the sources you sent, especially those excerpts from the Spiritual Brain audiobook, they offer some really interesting perspectives, I'd say.
Yeah, for sure. Like this whole God gene idea. Geneticist Dean Hamer, he's the one who came up with that theory,
Right.
right? Linking the VMAT2 gene with self-transcendence. I mean, when I first heard about that, I was blown away. They even called it the God gene. But then the audiobook goes into all these counter-arguments. What did you think about all that?
Well, the media definitely jumped on that God gene label, that's for sure. But, you know, we've got to look closer at this. Hamer's study, what it found was a correlation, not a cause. And to be honest, a pretty weak one at that, VMAT2 variations. They only accounted for less than 1% of the differences in, well, in people's self-transcendence scores.
Hmm. So not exactly a sure thing then.
Exactly. Plus, on top of that, self-transcendence itself, I mean, that's a pretty broad concept, isn't it? Feeling connected to nature, believing in things like ESP, those all kind of fall under that same umbrella, don't they? It's not a simple thing to isolate.
Yeah, that's true. I was also struck by what the audiobook said about twin studies. Just because twins share similar spiritual beliefs doesn't automatically mean it's genetic, right?
Right, that's where it gets interesting. Identical twins, they often grow up in very similar environments, and that can have a huge influence on their beliefs, you know?
Okay.
The audiobook actually gives this great example. Two sisters, Gloria and Louise, both religious, but their paths to their faith were totally different. It shows you just how much our upbringing and experiences mix with any, well, any potential genetic predisposition.
Okay, so maybe a single God gene is a bit too simplistic, but does that mean genetics plays no role at all?
Not necessarily, no. Genes do have an influence on our personalities, and certain traits might make someone more open to spiritual experiences. Think about someone who's naturally inclined to be open and curious. They might be more likely to explore spiritual ideas, you see.
That makes sense. So it's more like this back and forth between nature and nurture.
Right, exactly. It's not like an on-off switch. Now, let's shift gears a bit. Your sources also talk about temporal lobe epilepsy, or TLE, and its connection to spiritual experiences. Pretty fascinating stuff.
Oh yeah, that one really caught my attention. There's this novel Lying Awake by Mark Saltzman, the main character, Sister St. John of the Cross. She has these intense religious visions because of TLE. It makes you wonder, are these spiritual experiences just a neurological thing?
It's a question that's been debated for a long time, especially among neurologists. Jeffrey Saver and John Rabin, for example, they argued that the limbic system, and especially the temporal lobes, are key to spiritual experiences. That part of the brain, it plays a big role in emotions, memory, sensory input, all sorts of things.
So are they saying that a TLE-induced short circuit in the temporal lobe could trigger these really intense spiritual episodes?
That's one theory. But the audiobook brings up some counter arguments too. First, they say that spiritual experiences probably involve a lot of different brain regions, not just the temporal lobes. It's like saying, enjoying a delicious meal is all because of your taste buds, but you're forgetting the smell, the texture, the whole atmosphere.
Right, it's about the whole experience, not just one part.
Exactly. And secondly, the whole idea of a temporal lobe personality that makes someone more religious, that's pretty controversial, and the evidence for it isn't really strong. And a lot of historical figures who people think might have had TLE, like Van Gogh or Dostoevsky, they probably had other conditions too. Attributing their artistic talents or their spiritual beliefs only to TLE, well, it's not very solid.
So it sounds like TLE might be a factor for some people, but it's not the be-all and end-all explanation for spirituality in general. It's a bit like saying, well, this person sees auras because of a brain anomaly, so everyone who sees auras must have a brain anomaly. Kind of a jump, wouldn't you say?
Exactly. And that brings us to a pretty controversial piece of research, Michael Persinger's God helmet experiment.
Oh, yeah, the God helmet. Now, that one really captured people's imaginations, didn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
you'd strap on a helmet and have a spiritual experience. That was pretty tempting. But the audiobook also talks about the doubts surrounding it.
The God helmet, the idea was that it would stimulate the temporal lobes using magnetic fields, and that would induce a sensed presence, which people often interpreted as a spiritual being. It got tons of media attention, especially when Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, wore it and said he didn't have a spiritual experience.
I remember reading about that. So what's the conclusion about the God helmet? Gateway to the divine or just a fancy head massager?
Well, the science is a bit murky, if I'm being honest. Critics say the experiment relied a lot on suggestion. The setting, the questionnaires they used, even the hype surrounding the whole thing, all of that could have influenced people to have a spiritual experience, even if the helmet itself wasn't doing anything.
Oh, so the good old placebo effect strikes again. But weren't there also problems with how the experiment was done?
Absolutely. Persinger didn't use brain imaging to actually confirm that the helmet was doing anything to the brain. And then you had other researchers who tried to replicate the experiment, but under stricter conditions, like the one led by Per Granqvist in Sweden. They couldn't get the same results.
So it looks like the God helmet is more about psychology than a direct connection to something spiritual.
That seems to be the general consensus, yes. It's a good reminder about the power of suggestion and how important it is to use solid scientific methods.
All right, so we've talked about the God gene, TLE, and the God helmet, all trying to find that elusive God spot. But it seems like the search for one specific area responsible for spirituality, well, it's come up empty so far.
That's right, but that doesn't mean the search is over. Maybe we've been looking too narrowly. Instead of focusing on a single spot, maybe we should think about the brain's overall ability to experience spirituality.
That's interesting. It's like we've been looking for a single light switch for spirituality when it might actually be more like a dimmer switch, something that affects various parts of the brain and how they work.
That's a great way to put it. And that idea actually opens up a whole new way of thinking about things. Instead of asking, where is spirituality in the brain? Maybe we should be asking, how does the brain make these experiences possible?
Now, that's what I call a real deep dive.
Mhm.
And I feel like we're just getting started, aren't we?
We've laid the foundation, and now we can venture into even more intriguing territory. Let's explore these alternative perspectives on how the brain plays a role in spirituality.
It sounds like a plan. Let's keep digging. Back again for more of our deep dive. So it seems like finding a specific God spot in the brain is, well, it's been pretty tough so far. Maybe we need to try a whole new way of looking at things.
I think you might be right about that. What if instead of focusing on just one location, we kind of zoom out and look at the brain as a whole? Think of it like a really complex instrument, one that can interact with a dimension we can't directly perceive.
Okay, I like that. Like the brain is like this sophisticated antenna or something picking up signals from a realm we can't quite grasp with our normal senses. Kind of like how some animals can sense magnetic fields to navigate. Maybe we have something similar, but for spiritual awareness.
That's a great comparison.
Yeah.
And it brings up some really interesting questions, doesn't it? Like, if this kind of spiritual dimension does exist, how does the brain actually process those signals? What's going on in there?
Yeah, that's the big mystery. Our sources don't really get into specific neural pathways or anything like that, but they do talk about some common themes that come up in spiritual experiences,
Yeah.
like self-transcendence, that feeling of being connected to something bigger than yourself.
Right. And that sense of connection, it could be linked to the brain's ability to, well, to integrate information from different sensory and cognitive systems. It's amazing how the brain does that. Imagine if it could shift its focus, even temporarily, away from the individual self and
Yeah.
towards a broader sense of unity with the world around us, or even the cosmos.
Wow, that would be a pretty incredible shift in perception. Makes me think of those descriptions you hear about mystical experiences in different spiritual traditions.
Yeah.
Where people talk about feeling a sense of oneness with everything.
Exactly. And those experiences often involve feelings of awe and wonder. Maybe those emotions are somehow tied to the brain's reward and emotional processing systems. Like they light up when we encounter something that just goes beyond our normal understanding of reality.
So instead of searching for a specific God spot, maybe we should be studying what's happening in the brain when people have those profound experiences of awe, wonder, and connection.
Exactly. By looking at how the brain acts during those moments, we might be able to understand its potential for spiritual awareness on a much deeper level.
And that brings up another interesting idea from our sources, the brain's capacity to generate a sensed presence, even when no one is physically there.
Yeah, that phenomenon, it pops up a lot in spiritual contexts, and it really makes you think about how the brain constructs our sense of self and how we perceive the world around us.
It's like the brain can create this feeling of another being, even when there's no external stimuli. It's kind of spooky when you really think about it.
I know, right? And this ability to create these internal experiences to make us feel something that isn't really there, it's pretty remarkable.
It makes me wonder if our brains are wired for connection in a way, deeper way than we realize. Maybe this capacity for a sense presence evolved to help us form bonds with each other, to feel like we belong to a group, something that was crucial for our survival back in the day.
That's a really compelling idea. It fits with that evolutionary perspective on spirituality, the idea that religious beliefs and practices might have developed to help people come together and cooperate.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If that's true, maybe those same brain mechanisms that helped us bond with each other could also be involved in those experiences of connection with, well, with something beyond the human realm, like a feeling of belonging to something much greater than ourselves.
Wow. Now that is a fascinating thought. It suggests that maybe the human brain is actually wired for both physical and spiritual connection, and they're intertwined in ways we don't fully understand yet.
So instead of a single God spot, maybe we should be focusing on the brain's overall capacity for connection. That ability to create a sense of belonging and unity, both with other people and with something that transcends us.
That's a really insightful way to put it. It shifts us away from this reductionist view of just one specific location and moves us towards a more complete understanding of how the brain functions and its potential for spiritual awareness.
And this way of looking at it avoids those problems we saw with the God gene and the God helmet theories. We're acknowledging that the brain is complex and spiritual experience is mysterious, and we're not trying to oversimplify things.
Exactly. It allows us to explore the relationship between our physical and spiritual selves in a way that's more subtle and respectful.
As we're talking, I'm realizing that this search for the biological roots of belief, it's actually led us to something even more profound. The brain's incredible capacity for awe, wonder, connection, and transcendence. It feels like we've stumbled upon a whole new set of questions that might actually take us beyond the traditional limits of neuroscience.
And that's the beauty of science, isn't it? It often takes us down these unexpected paths, opening up new avenues of inquiry, expanding our understanding of the world in ways we could never have predicted.
It's like we've set sail from the familiar shores of what we know, what we can measure and explain, and now we're navigating these uncharted waters where the map is constantly changing.
Exactly. And in those uncharted waters, who knows what amazing islands of knowledge we might find? New ways of understanding ourselves and our place in the universe.
Okay, as we're wrapping up this part of our deep dive, let's think about this. If the brain can actually interact with a spiritual dimension, what does that mean for how we understand what it means to be human? What possibilities does that open up?
It challenges us to think beyond the limitations of our current scientific understanding, to acknowledge that there might be a reality beyond our current methods of measurement and observation.
And it suggests that the human experience might be even richer and more complex than we ever imagined.
I completely agree. It raises this possibility of a deeper connection to something bigger than ourselves, a sense of purpose and meaning that goes beyond the purely material world.
And that could have a profound impact on how we live our lives, how we treat each other, how we understand our place in this vast cosmos. It's a change in perspective that could lead us to a more compassionate, interconnected, and meaningful way of being in the world.
I couldn't have said it better myself. By embracing those mysteries of consciousness and the potential for this spiritual dimension, we open ourselves up to a much broader and richer view of what it means to be human.
So, as we move into the final part of our deep dive, let's keep these possibilities in mind. Let's explore the implications of this broader view of the brain and its capacity for spiritual awareness. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into spirituality and the brain. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? We started by searching for a specific God spot and ended up considering the brain as this receiver for something much bigger, maybe even a spiritual reality. So now the big question is, what does it all mean?
That's what makes this so exciting, I think. We've moved beyond those familiar, purely material explanations, and now it's like we're explorers charting a whole new territory.
Yeah, it really feels that way. We need new tools, new ways of thinking, even to start navigating this uncharted territory. It's exciting, but it's also a little bit daunting.
I agree. But think about the potential here. What if we embrace this idea of a spiritual dimension interacting with the brain? It changes how we understand consciousness itself.
So are you saying that instead of seeing consciousness as just a byproduct of brain activity like a side effect, maybe we start to see it as something fundamental to reality, something that exists beyond the physical brain?
Exactly. The brain, then, it becomes less about creating consciousness and more about, well, more about mediating it. Like it's this interface between our physical selves and something much vaster.
Okay, yeah, that's a mind-blowing concept. It's like the brain is a translator, helping us understand information coming from a place our normal senses just can't reach.
I love that analogy. And if we think of the brain as this mediator, it opens up so many new research questions. How does the brain actually translate those spiritual signals? Are there certain neural pathways or processes involved? We're only just beginning to ask these questions.
It would be amazing to study people who've had these really intense spiritual experiences to see if there are any patterns in their brain activity.
Absolutely. We could use brain imaging techniques to look at what's happening during meditation, prayer, or other spiritual practices. Who knows what we might discover about how the brain works?
It makes me wonder about neuroplasticity, too. How the brain can change and adapt throughout our lives. Could certain spiritual practices actually rewire the brain over time, making it more receptive to these kinds of experiences?
Now, that's a fascinating question. I think it's definitely possible. Engaging in things like meditation or mindfulness, it could strengthen the neural pathways that allow us to tap into that spiritual awareness. It's like exercising a muscle, but for the brain.
So we could be talking about a whole new field of study here, one that combines neuroscience and psychology, maybe even philosophy and theology.
Yeah.
We'd need to look at it from all those angles to really understand this complex picture.
Exactly. It would have to be a truly interdisciplinary field, pushing the boundaries of how we study human consciousness and the mystery of the spiritual realm. We can't be afraid to think outside the box.
What's really striking me is that this shift in our thinking has implications far beyond just scientific research. It could completely change how we see ourselves and our place in the universe.
I think you're right. If we can genuinely accept the possibility of a spiritual dimension, it gives us this feeling of being connected to something much greater than ourselves. And that's a powerful concept.
Yeah, it is. It's a concept that could lead us towards a more compassionate and ethical way of living, one that acknowledges the profound interconnectedness of everything.
And it could also reawaken that sense of awe and wonder we were talking about before, that feeling of being part of something truly magnificent and mysterious.
So as we wrap up our deep dive today, I'm left with a feeling of, well, a feeling of both humility and excitement. Humility because we've only just begun to explore this vast and intricate topic, and excitement because the possibilities for future exploration are just mind-blowing.
I feel exactly the same way. It's a reminder that our understanding of the world and ourselves is constantly evolving. And who knows, maybe through this exploration, we'll rediscover that connection to the spiritual dimension that's always been a part of what it means to be human.
It's been an amazing journey exploring these ideas with you and with our listeners today.
The pleasure was all ours. We hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, that it's inspired you to keep exploring this amazing intersection of spirituality and the brain.
Because who knows what incredible discoveries are waiting for us on this path.
Yeah.
Keep those questions coming, keep searching for those answers, and keep diving deep into the mysteries of the universe. Until next time.